This recording is going to cover the new version of OpenShift, and that happens to be OpenShift 4.8 with F5 CIS. This specific user guide and demo is really going to cover Big IP Standalone. As you can see from the diagram, there's one Big IP. And what's so significant here is Big IP working with F5 CIS running in OpenShift, and specifically an OpenShift 4.8 cluster. The networking configuration that I'm using within the OpenShift cluster is OVN-Kubernetes. So OpenShift introduced OVN-Kubernetes as a advanced networking option, or as a networking option, instead of using the default OpenShift SDN. And OpenShift is transitioning to OVN-Kubernetes. I don't know the exact release, but in 4.8, OpenShift SDN is still default. But a lot of users have requested OVN-Kubernetes support. And so that's one of the reasons why I've created this user guide as well as this video. Now, it's very important to understand the difference between traffic within the cluster, that's potentially pod to pod, or pod from a worker to a worker, or pod from a master to the worker, etc., versus pod from an external device like the Big IP, or an external device like a Linux machine. And so that is what's really important to understand about the current implementation of OVN-Kubernetes. And there was this feature that was introduced in OVN-Kubernetes, I believe in 4.5, that talks a little bit about this hybrid overlay. And that's currently what we're discussing in this video. So I want to make that very clear. So this video is going to talk about and document OpenShift 4.8 integration with CIS and a standalone Big IP using OVN-Kubernetes with this hybrid overlay feature. And this hybrid overlay feature is still using VxLAN. So all communication that comes into the Big IP is going to traverse a VxLAN tunnel to the OpenShift cluster, which is then going to provide encapsulation to the pod via Geneve. So the new protocol for OVN-Kubernetes is, of course, Geneve. However, I believe this feature is still in development. If you want to call it external gateway or gateway feature from OpenShift to an external device, is currently not there in 4.8 currently today. And so if you want to use a Big IP or an external device, you have to use this overlay. I don't know if it's coming in 4.9. I'm going to find out. I have a meeting with Red Hat in the up and coming days. So I'll put a comment, or if you have questions, reach out to your Red Hat representative and ask them potentially when is external gateway feature coming for end-to-end Geneve from an outside device into the Big IP, but from an outside device, that Big IP, into the OpenShift cluster. So as you can see in the diagram, you can see that the Big IP device, all of the traffic into the cluster is traversing the VxLAN tunnel into the cluster, and then communication within the cluster is communicating via Geneve. And we'll talk a little bit about these annotations, but you can actually see from the diagram that we have a hybrid overlay external gateway, which is a self IP on the Big IP. And this is at the pod level. So it's really important. It's at the pod level that you create these annotations. And we'll get into that. The overlay VTIP, which is configured here, in my case is also the big IP, and that's just another self IP on the big IP. That is really probably my external IP address that all of my clusters are on. So all of my nodes are actually on that, and then the private or pod network, if you want to call it that, is at 10.142, which is across VxLAN, which is encapsulated across, if you want to call it, under the cloud. It's kind of how it works. The pod network is really important here because this is all based on the namespace. So as you can see what I've mentioned, OVN-Kubernetes overlay is based on the namespace. So important. I haven't tested multiple namespaces, and so this could get quite tricky. In this case, CIS is just monitoring the default namespace. And we have to now monitor a namespace. We cannot monitor all namespaces. There's so many namespaces now in 4.8. And so we want to specifically go down and monitor namespaces. And you can see here that for this pod network with the default namespace, this is the IP address of the pod. As you can see, 2.18, you can actually see it on the big IP there. There's one of the pods. And its gateway, external gateway, is this hybrid overlay gateway that is inside OpenShift that actually will route this traffic externally out across the VxLAN tunnel. So a lot more to come. We're going to get a lot of information about this, and I'm going to throw a few things out there. This is probably one of the very early videos of 4.8, but let's get into it a little bit more detail. So what's really important to understand is that if you're doing hybrid overlay, it has to be enabled, has to be enabled during the installation. And that's actually quite tricky because you cannot migrate to hybrid overlay. You can migrate to OVN-Kubernetes, but you won't be able to integrate your big IP using cluster IP, only using node port. So it's almost greenfield at this point. It's really interesting. So you have to kind of think about that. The other question I cannot answer is what happens if you have enabled hybrid? What is the migration from hybrid overlay to external end-to-end Geneve? Don't know that answer. And so that's all coming. Right now it's not developed. So it's not here today, else I would be doing that. And probably this is going to be the default for a while. But I'm going to get those answers. And so you can get those answers from Red Hat, specifically their PM group. So it's really important. It says you must configure hybrid networking with OVN-Kubernetes during the installation of your cluster. You cannot switch. And so that's really, really, really important. You have to follow the procedure. I did this a few times. I did this a few times in building this cluster. And I skipped one or two items, and I did not follow the procedure. You have to follow the documentation. It's actually pretty well documented. I provided all the links in this YouTube video. You can actually see all the links to the documentation is here. But I've actually broken it down for you nicely in the install process. So let's go take a look at the install process. This is the install process of OpenShift 4.8, and this video might be quite long because I'm going through the install process of OpenShift 4.8 with OVN-Kubernetes hybrid overlay, and then I'm going to go into the big IP as well as giving you a quick demo. So if you look here, we're going to create the install config. This is not new. I'm using IPI, which is very simple. So I create the install config, provide all the VMware information. This is of my vCenter cluster. I'm using vCenter 7. It's the latest version. I have two of the IPs, the virtual IP. This is for the API. And of course, this is for the ingress. There's more stuff coming here about using big IP for the ingress. I'm going to do that once I've documented all of this. The base cluster, etc. And so as you'll notice, it's finished. And what it does is it places the install config into the IPI directory. So let's go ahead and open that in a new tab here. And so what you have to do is once you've created this, you create this first. What you have to do is you have to go and change you must change line number 25 from network type OpenShift SDN to OVN-Kubernetes. If you want to learn more about OpenShift SDN, I've already created 2 videos that are on my channel that cover standalone as well as Big IP cluster. You can go and view those. OpenShift SDN is the default for OpenShift 4.8 and probably 4.9. So that's the first thing you do, change that. And so I have that as step. I have that in if further down. So the other thing that you have to also do is that you need to create this manifest. So this manifest is so important. If you skip this, you're actually going to have a problem. What this manifest is going to do is it's going to create all these networks. And so you create the manifest. As you can see, I've created the manifest in this IPI directory. And then what you're going to do then is you're going to create a file called cluster network 3. This is actually the gateway. If you go back to my diagram, it's actually the gateway. You can see there 128.2.3. It creates this 2.3 network. And this is for the gateway. And so that's what I'm creating here. You have to add this as your default network, which is your default network. You have to add this OVN-Kubernetes config, and you have to add this one line here, hybrid overlay config. And so what you do is you create this file. I have this file as an example. I can open this file as an example here. So you can just clone my file. You don't have to make any changes. Just leave this as default unless you want to change this. And then you have to drop this. You have to drop that YAML file into the manifest directly. As you can see here, I'm copying this into the manifest directory. It's really important that this manifest directory is there and that you copy that in there. And then once that's done, you're ready to create your cluster. And when you create your cluster, you just use the create cluster command. It will create the cluster, etc. And you can see the cluster's up. And then once that is done, you can validate. You can validate by running this Kubernetes command or this kubeconfig command, sorry, to make sure that your OVN-Kubernetes config, there's your Geneva port, to make sure that your hybrid overlay is configured. Type OVN-Kubernetes. So that's pretty much it. It's actually not that hard. If you just follow, then if you just follow the documentation, you'll actually get through it. Pretty simple. So that's actually how to install OpenShift 4.8. I've provided all the files. You can just copy the repo and you can make the changes. So once that's done, now you have the networking configuration. You need to configure the big IP piece, and so this is really important. So this gets back to something very similar with what we did before in configuring the VxLAN tunnels. So the first thing is you got to create the profile. So just create this exact same profile. You can change this name if you want. I don't. I just call it VxLAN multi-point. It is multi-point. I recommend leave the port numbers the same. Make sure if you have a firewall between Big IP and the cluster, bidirectional, make sure this port is open. So once you create the tunnel, you need to create the tunnel profile. And the tunnel profile is important, and you need to give the tunnel profile a name. I highly recommend you use this name, OpenShift_VxLAN, because this name needs to be added to the CIS arguments, the CIS configuration. It needs to be able to reach this. So it's really important. If you don't get those two right, you will never get the FDB entries. FDB entries are forward database entries that are in the Big IP that provide the network characteristics of all the nodes, specifically for VxLAN tunnels. This is the Big IP's IP address. It's the public IP, or if you want to call it the external IP. That's the address that I'm reaching the Big IP on, because my entire OpenShift cluster is on this 10.192.125 network. And so that's one of the reasons why it's using that address. It's an external address, actually. It's not a management address. So that's how to configure the profile for the tunnel list. What's really important is this right here, is the VNI. I don't believe you're going to be able to change this VNI. You're only going to be able to create one VNI. And can you create multiple profiles? I don't know. I'd have to try it. Maybe it will allow me, but it probably won't, because Big IP can probably only create one number here. And if it sees the same number, it'll probably throw an error. Again, I haven't tried it. The last thing is you need to create a self IP. Now, this is a little tricky. This is really tricky, and this took quite some time. That's why we haven't seen a video in a few weeks. This is the most important. It's the self IP. And the self IP is from this specific network. But this supernet, super network here, or supernet that I created, encompasses the whole /14 as well. And so this is the only way that I could get this working. I tried a /14, it wouldn't work. So I had to use /12. It's the only thing I can get working. I asked Red Hat in a support ticket. I couldn't answer. So I can't tell you why it's a /12. All I can tell you, you have to use /12. And so it's really important. And so this number here, I just use 60 because that's the big IP. And I just created a 2 just because that's what they recommended. So if you look back here at the diagram, you can actually see that is the self IP for the overlay. And you can actually see that here, the external gateway, overlay external gateway 10.142.2.60. So that's so important to have that correct. So going down to the big IP, you can see if I blow this up, you can see there is the self IP 10.142.2.60. That's the self IP here. And you can see that it's just a regular local traffic group. That's the VxLAN tunnel profile right there. So that's really, really, really important to get that right. Create a partition on the big IP for OpenShift management. So this is where CIS is going to write all the configuration to. So if we log into big IP, we can change to that OpenShift partition. We can go down to the virtual servers, and you can see at this point I don't have any virtual servers, so there's really nothing. But if I do go down to the networking and actually look at the tunnels, I actually have all my FTP entries. So there's three masters, 3 nodes. That's the 3 master node cluster. Okay. So at that point, now we're ready to deploy CIS, and we've done many videos. I've created many videos on how to deploy CIS. Pretty simple. I have 2 files here, just to run through this quickly because it is kind of important. What's really important here is that we still have to use, let me make this a bit bigger. We still have to use this argument. We still got to use this OpenShift SDN argument. We're using OpenShift routes. In the next version of OpenShift, in the next version of CIS, we're going to support multiple route virtual servers. It's actually kind of interesting. It's in development at this time. So this is really important. We're doing cluster. Please specify the namespace. You're not going to be able to monitor all namespaces here. There's just too many. CIS will start monitoring all namespaces. So I highly recommend cut down the namespaces all, because you're going to need to monitor this namespace specifically for this hybrid model. CIS can monitor many namespaces. Just list the namespaces that CIS is monitoring. I know that this is quite nice, a prunet if you want to call it that. So it's not monitoring everything because there's a lot of traffic and there's a lot of namespaces that are being configured. So that's the configuration of CIS. It's a little smaller. And so once CIS is deployed, you can go, and if you want, you can actually log into, and you can actually look at CIS. You can see CIS is here. There's one pod. So I'm actually in the workload deployment. I'm up at the kube system. You can actually see here is CIS right here. I can actually view the edit the deployment if I want. This is the deployment. I can go back if I want to. I can actually edit this YAML here. It's the actual YAML file of this deployment. So you can actually see here's the arguments right here that are right there. So that's just the CIS deployment. So that's kind of how to validate. You need all of these 5. Make sure you've got your cluster role bindings. There's many different ways that you can configure the password. I just run the simple script. It's actually pretty easy. Works really well. So really important. This is the next step. You need to add OVN-Kubernetes advanced networking annotations for the CNI. And this is per namespace. So this gets a little tricky. That's right, it's per namespace. So this is kind of where you get that output by the pod. So my pods are actually on namespace default. And so this is per deployment, per pod deployment. So per your application pods. So if we go take a look here, let's go take a look at my pods. Let's change this to default. As you can see, there's only one here. So these are four pods right here that are in the default namespace. If I take this down to the deployment, my F5 demo here, and I can increase this. I'll do that in a minute once the route is there. So these are the 4 pods that's there. The YAML file is very, very, very simple on this pods. As you can see, it's just pulling this in from F5 Dev Central. But that's really important. So what this is doing is that this is actually telling the pod that you are using the hybrid overlay external gateway, and that you are using the VTIP, the hybrid overlay VTIP, to communicate out of the cluster, right? Remember, anything inside the cluster is going to use Geneve, but anything from an external gateway is going to use the hybrid overlay, because external gateway Geneve support is not there in OpenShift. So apply this. Don't try and modify. Just apply this, because it will add this to the existing network of that pod. And so you can actually look at that in great detail in a minute. I'll show you that in a second. So the next thing is to simply just deploy your pods. I have a simple 4 pods that I just showed you. These are the pods that I have. And if I go down to the pod, there's 4 pods right there. So those are my 4 pods. Those are my 4 pods that are running. So just deploy those 4 pods. And if we go look at the networking, we can actually go and describe the pod. You can actually see this. This is really interesting. So here's the annotation. So this is actually what gets added. Here's the annotation for the networking. You can see the address of the pod, the gateway. You can actually see the status of the networking. So this is the OVN network. It's actually much simpler than it was before. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of users really like to do OVN-Kubernetes, because it actually is really simple. And so this configuration is actually pretty simple. And I think once we have external gateway support, it's going to be even easier. And so this is the pod network. So at this point now, what we can do is we can go ahead and create a route. So I have a route right here. It's a very, very, very simple route. So if I do an OC create -f, and this route is called F5 demo. So that will go ahead, and you can actually see this is the API call. And let's hit that API call. So you can actually see there is the API call right there. It was a success. So if we go to Big AP, we're actually going to go up to our virtual server. You can see the virtual servers were added, and you can go down to your pod. This is the most important, to make sure that we have 4 here, and that these are the 4 pods that are in this environment. If I want to connect to the virtual server, I can connect here. And so this is my site. Let me remove this just to make sure that there's no games here. So if you connect to my site.f5 demo, it comes up. This is obviously the big IP. I'm connected to 2.17. There's obviously persistence in here. And so that is the connection from external. If I wanted to go and let's say I wanted to add 8, I could actually go back to the deployment here. I could actually click on this F5 demo and I can add 8 here. Actually, there's 9. You can see here that this is actually getting added. As you can see, that's pretty quick. There is the API. There's the API. In this case, because they added them so quick, and there's no buffering on the CIS side, CIS is updating Big AP as each of them come. Maybe what's better is to use a post delay so that we gather them all at one time, and then maybe you make a one-time update. It really depends upon how busy your Big AP is. But as you can see there, I added 4 of them from that perspective. And so now if I go back to the Big AP, refresh this, there's going to be a total of 9 there across all different networks because they're from different pods. There's different pod networks there from that perspective. So let's go ahead and recap. I do apologize, it actually is a long video and you can actually see the success there. If you wanted to look at the route, it's there. But there's many different configurations you can do with the route that's supported. So again, quite a long video. We talked a lot about OVN-Kubernetes. This video really covers the very simple installation of OpenShift 4.8, specifically for OVN-Kubernetes hybrid overlay. And this is how to connect a F5 big IP using CIS for the orchestration of the pods and the services, specifically for a namespace with this hybrid overlay. So we have VxLAN for external gateway, external traffic, and we have Geneve for internal pod communication. Thank you very much. If you like this video, like and subscribe. There's going to be lots more. I'm starting to work on a node port implementation where you won't require this hybrid overlay. I'm going to work on that next. And then after that, I'm going to work on a big IP HA cluster or big IP cluster instead of standalone. That's coming probably in the next couple days, as well as some other stuff as well.